Okay, offset lithography. We've talked about engraved stamps and gravure as an engraving process. We're going to look at now how offset lithography happens. This is a four color offset press. Lithography, litho means stone. Printers now use metal or polymer printing plates. And the key is that compared with engraved printing, the difference is that the ink is on the surface of the printing plate rather than in recess. And the trick is, how do you create the hydrophilic and oleophilic areas on the plate? You allow the ink to adhere it, you chemically modify it somehow so that there are oleophilic areas that attract the oil-based inks and hydrophilic areas that attract water. So on the printing plate, there are some places that are full of water and some places that are hydrophilic that attract water and some places that are oleophilic that attract ink. So let's look at this, how it works. There is a water roller and the printing plate goes past the water roller. Water gets applied to the hydrophilic areas. Then it goes past the ink roller where ink is applied to the oleophilic areas. This is not offset lithography. This is just an ordinary lithographic print.
There is between the water application and the ink application, there is a wiper blade that removes the excess water.
Okay. The paper is pressed onto the plate, ink is transferred, producing a lithographic print. You have to allow it to dry. There is some water that can get onto your print. Offset lithography, the printing plate transfers the ink to an intermediate offset cylinder, typically rubber, also oleophilic. The transfer cylinder delivers the ink to the stamped paper. Transfer cylinder is also called the blanket or offset cylinder. There's a lot of advantages to offset lithography: longer printing plate life, thinner ink layers, faster drying, overall faster printing. And here the printing plate is the actual image on the stamp, not a mirror image. If you're just doing regular lithography, you have to have an offset image on the printing plate. So in offset lithography, you have the dampening rollers that apply the water. Then you have the ink rollers that apply the ink. So there's no ink here now. The ink is here. The ink comes here on the plate cylinder, comes around. And then you have the transfer cylinder. And the transfer cylinder is hydrophobic. So the water doesn't stick on the transfer cylinder, only the ink. As the transfer cylinder, it literally just transfers the ink from the plate cylinder onto the stamp paper. And when we talk about web offset, it refers to the paper coming from rolls as opposed to sheets. So here we have the water dampening rollers, the ink rollers that provide ink on the plate cylinder. This is where the printing plate is, onto the transfer cylinder, going in the opposite direction, and the stamp paper is fed, and we see the red coming from the ink roller onto the paper. It's pushed up against the impression roller. If you're doing 4-color, it's the same process repeated 4 times with 4 separate colors, basically your red, yellow, cyan, and black. And in each case, each of these contribute their colored ink to the final stamp paper. How can you have reverse offset varieties? Those are stamps where the image of the stamp, generally faint, appears on the back of the stamp. It can either be a result of a printing error, or if the panes of stamps are stacked before the ink completely dries, and the ink transfers to the back of the pane above it. Reverse offset varieties occur when the older engraved issues, because they use slower drying inks. Because on an engraved stamp, you have to apply the ink and then you have to wipe it off so that it's only in the recesses. You can't have an ink that dries very quickly. You can also have a reverse offset during offset lithography. Here's an example of how it can happen. If you have an ink roller and it transfers the ink onto the transfer cylinder, but for whatever reason, the stamp paper flow is interrupted. The ink comes from the transfer cylinder onto the impression roller. And when the stamp then paper, when the the transfer cylinder gets the ink to the impression roller. When the paper flow starts, of course, the impression roller comes around and drops the ink on the back of the stamp. Here's an example of a reverse offset on Canadian. Now it's interesting here because when you look at reverse offset on the engraved stamps, the offset, the reverse image, isn't necessarily in the proper position. It can be half and half. There can be a dramatic shift in the location of the reverse offset on an engraved offset stamp. But in a lithography, it is in exactly the right position. In this case, it is just the black ink that has managed to get from, presumably, the impression roller onto the back of the stamp. So a registration error is another kind of variety that you can have if one color is in not perfect alignment with another. There can be an overlapping of colors. We call them a registration error. Sometimes the registration errors are very dramatic and produce an interesting effect. And sometimes it's not interesting. If the interesting effect is so dramatic, it can actually become a variety listed in the catalog, like snow on the leaves, where there was a dramatic shift and the white part stayed on the leaves. So it's very common on both offset lithography and engraved stamps. So registration errors are common.
Isn't it the case that colors that are not among the four colors are produced by layering two types of ink on the same place?
It could also happen that way too. Yes, you have a red.
That's how they print. For example, they print green, which is a mixture of blue and yellow.
Yes, black is not aligned here, and it overlaps with the blue. So that's what happens here. Here's an example of a registration area on our map stamps. It is in various shades, and number 85 and 86. And in this case, we see here the imperial penny postage. It was just at the time that the imperial penny postage was adopted for all countries in the British Commonwealth. And here we see a dramatic shift of the black shift is coming way down, and here you can see the difference between the black and the red there. And here now we see where the black shift is up. And so the red, here you can see the brown is here and the black is way at the top. So you can have registration areas on multicolored stamps. You can't have them on stamps that are on a single color. That's it.